welcome to Black Americana. I'm Ashley, and in this video we are doing a deep dive into the history of Mississippi and how it aligns with the movie Sinners. Since the film was released, I have seen so many questions about the history of Mississippi and how it relates to the film. So I said, you know what? That's up my alley and in my backyard. So why don't we do a video? Now, this is not about the symbolism, and it is not a full-out movie review, but I do hope it enhances the conversations that have been sparked around this movie. So if you're ready, keep watching. Mississippi native and great American author William Faulkner once said, "To understand the world, you must first understand a place like Mississippi." Mississippi is also known as the birthplace of America's music, where, of course, the blues was created and became the basis of modern popular music. Another key aspect of Mississippi's identity is that it is a state that knew immediate prosperity and then immediate poverty. In 1860, before the Civil War broke out, Mississippi had more millionaires per capita than any other state in the Union. That is, of course, not including the enslaved population. So let's look at some of the people who have made Mississippi what it is. Naturally, this video is from a Black American ethnic lens. So we are clear, Black American means a descendant of United States chattel slavery. It'll be anchored in the Mississippi experience. During slavery, Mississippi had the largest number of slaves, and even today remains the state with the highest percentage of Black population. Prior to European colonization, Mississippi was comprised of 5 core Native American tribes: the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Biloxi, the Natchez, and the Yazoo. The first European settlers in the state were the French in 1699, with the Spanish following shortly afterwards. As European encampment grew in what became Mississippi, Europeans often found themselves in conflict with the native tribes. However, the natives had a lot of conflict amongst themselves. The Choctaw and the French formed an alliance to defeat the Natchez and Yazoo. The Biloxi were decimated by disease, but the Chickasaw and Choctaw maintained a stronghold. The British assumed control of the French territory after the conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763. The British then gave their territory to the United States after the American Revolution, and the Mississippi Territory was established in 1798. In 1817, Mississippi became the 20th state admitted into the Union. The Irish came to Mississippi for 2 primary reasons. For one, they were seeking to live in places that had less of a British cultural stronghold, considering Ireland and England's turbulent relationship. Although the United States had gained independence, the Northeast still had a significant British influence. Economically, Mississippi was heralded for its fertile land and agricultural industry. The Irish saw the newness, for lack of a better term, of Mississippi as an opportunity to gain footing. Many traveled by steamboat to reach Mississippi or arrived by wagon. The move to Mississippi was prosperous for some Irish. In fact, the first native-born Mississippian to be elected as governor was Jared Brandon, whose father was an Irish immigrant who fought in the American Revolution and whose mother was a first-generation Irish American. And like Remick and Sinners, they came from North Carolina. Brandon's time as governor, which stretched from 1826 to 1832, was known as the Flush Times and encompasses Mississippi's most prosperous era. Although he was affluent, he maintained a deep love for his Irish heritage. He often voiced concerns for the plight of poor whites. In the 19th century, poor white was often synonymous with the Irish. The Scottish also grew in presence in Mississippi, with some being hired as the overseer on plantations owned by Irish Americans. And as I am sure many of us know, Ireland and Scotland are Celtic nations. Keep that in mind moving forward. Brandon's tenure was also known as the era of the common man. Previously, Mississippi only allowed white men whose fathers owned property to vote in elections. Brandon led the charge to allow all white men to vote. He was one of the rare Southern politicians to denounce slavery as an evil, but he was a slave owner himself. His true reasons for wanting to restrict slavery were more complicated than a moral resolve. He felt Mississippi, having such a large slave population, made it harder for poor whites to find work. He also felt the continued presence of the Native Americans impeded opportunities for land purchases for white residents. In 1829, Brandon signed the Sale of Indian Lands Act, which authorized the state of Mississippi to survey and sell land occupied by Native Americans. This legislation paved the way for the United States Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act of 1830, otherwise known as the Trail of Tears. And one of the greatest atrocities in American history, thousands of Native Americans were forced to leave their indigenous lands east of the Mississippi River and relocate to a new settlement west of the Mississippi River. 15,000 of the 18,000 Mississippi Choctaw went on a 3-year trek. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 into law, securing one of his goals set forth in his State of the Union speech. But Andrew Jackson and Jared Brandon had more than just politics in common. Jackson was the child of Scots-Irish immigrants, and he was born on the state lines of what is now North Carolina and South Carolina. So here we are with another Remick connection. So could it be the Choctaw were chasing Remick because Irish Americans were instrumental in displacing their ancestors? One dynamic often overlooked is Native Americans and their role in chattel slavery. Some members of the various Mississippi tribes were captured and worked on plantations, but some Choctaw became slave owners themselves. There were also marriages between the slaves and Native Americans. Consequently, there were a significant number of slaves, meaning black folks, who were also on the Trail of Tears. Now, the Choctaw did not take the expulsion lying down, but infighting again unraveled their cause. As forced removal became more of a threat to the indigenous population, the Choctaw elected Greenwood LeFlore as their chief. He was the son of a half-Choctaw woman from an elite clan and a French father. Since status was conferred through the maternal line in Choctaw culture, LeFlore was granted high status. Additionally, the Choctaw began to view members with European ancestry as advantageous to navigating American relations. LeFlore felt the best approach to the land removal was to comply with the federal government and sign the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek to solidify the government's plans. Many Choctaw grew to resent LeFlore as they felt he did not fight hard enough against the land removal. Some tribal members also resented that he was not full-blooded Choctaw, and another issue might have been that in the treaty, LeFlore received 1,000 acres for himself. The Choctaw staged a coup and removed LeFlore. Now out of a job, guess what LeFlore did? He built a plantation. The centerpiece of the 15,000-acre property was Malmaison, inspired by his love for the French dictator Napoleon. By the time the American Civil War began in the 1860s, he owned more than 400 slaves. But as the Civil War broke out, he sided with the Union, meaning the North, and refused to allow the Confederacy, which was the South, to use his property to advance their cause. The Civil War began in April 1861, and by that June, the Choctaw Nation and remaining Mississippi Choctaw pledged allegiance to the Confederacy. Because of how Southern history is framed, that might be surprising, but let's break it down. Since the Mississippi Choctaw refused to go on the Trail of Tears, they were ignored by the federal government and lived in abject poverty. The Mississippi Choctaw joined the Confederacy as an act of rebellion against the failed promises of the Union, and the Confederacy made assurances that the Choctaw would be granted their own state and their assets would be protected. One of the assets they wanted to protect was ownership of the black people they held in slavery. Now, this so-called new country, the Confederate States of America, was led by Jefferson Davis as president. He was raised in Kentucky but made his fortune as a young man in Mississippi and served in the U.S. Senate representing the state. He was born to a Scots-Irish mother and a Welsh father. As we know, Wales is also a Celtic country, so we are seeing another Remic connection. The Mississippi Choctaw wavered in their loyalty to the Confederacy, but ultimately remained attached until the Civil War ended in May 1865. This leads us to an issue that has yet to be resolved between certain Native American tribes and some Black Americans. Although the Confederacy lost the Civil War, the Choctaw refused to emancipate their slaves. Now, they were not the only tribe doing this, but for this video, we are going to focus on the Choctaw. The Choctaw agreed to the Choctaw and Chickasaw Treaty of Washington in the spring of 1866. In the treaty, the Choctaw agreed that the emancipated slaves would be granted tribal citizenship and the same rights and protections as those given to the existing tribal members. The emancipated slaves and their descendants are known as Choctaw-Freedmen. Some of these freedmen had Native American ancestry, but they were not awarded the social ranking of a full-blooded Choctaw or one who was mixed with European ancestry. Over the years, measures have been taken to purge Choctaw freemen from the tribe and block the enrollment of new members. One of the unfortunate things about current Black American discourse is we have been bullied out of talking about our Native American connections. Granted, some Black folks took it too far by saying, "I got Indian in my family," but for some, it is true. Some of the Native American tribes mentioned earlier, like the Yazoo, heavily intermarried with Black people during the time of slavery, but they do not have federal recognition and are considered extinct as a tribe. In short, a lot of politics over ancestry and residency factor into who is federally recognized as Native American. If you are Black American and someone in your family mentions a Choctaw background, keep in mind you might not be ethnically Choctaw, but you are possibly a Choctaw-Freedmen descendant. There is current litigation going on about Black Americans who have been wrongfully denied citizenship and benefits, so please remain aware of the situation and explore your legal options. But getting back to the 19th century, the lingering tension between the Choctaw and Black Americans stems from the failure of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the period during and after the Civil War where the South was tasked with ridding itself of its antebellum ways. It was an incredibly complicated time for Black Americans. Some thrived, with Mississippi electing the first Black United States Senator, Hiram Revels. In contrast, many Black Americans were in utter confusion on where to go and how to provide for themselves. Many former slaves starved, returned to their former plantations to find work, or were jailed for being homeless. Even with these challenges, some Black Americans were determined not to return to the field for work. As the wealthy planter class navigated this new reality in the South, they brought in Chinese men to supplement the loss of slavery, but their time picking cotton didn't last long. By the 1870s, the Chinese became merchants throughout the Delta, specifically in Black communities. As time went on, the Chinese essentially became a buffer class. The phrase buffer class is not one we usually associate with the United States, but within Black and white dichotomies, they do exist. A lot of people were excited to see the Mississippi Delta Chinese in centers because it is a novelty in Hollywood, and many were unaware of their presence in the Mississippi Delta. But for some who are familiar with the history, they were unsettled by how the Black and Chinese dynamic was portrayed. Many might be asking, how did the Chinese manage to leapfrog Black Americans so quickly in the Mississippi Delta? For one, the Chinese had a trade partner in their home country. Black Americans have never had such. This is not an attempt to play oppression Olympics, but just to give the reality of the situation. Black Americans are a stateless people other than the United States. Most white planters and merchants were not willing to supply the goods for a viable Black-owned store. Although the Chinese faced prejudice in the United States as well, they had another source to acquire goods. A lot of people don't know that the economic model the Mississippi Delta Chinese created has been replicated by other immigrant groups for generations now. So it is basically step one. Find an economically depressed, predominantly Black community that is unlikely to be granted funding and permits to sustain a business. Step 2. Trade with your country of origin or utilize an immigrant program to supply the business. One thing I want to reiterate is that when the Chinese arrived in the Mississippi Delta, only the men came. During this time, the United States was more restrictive on chain migration. Chinese men lived in the Black community and mated with Black women. Some Chinese men and Black women married and started families. As the Chinese grew in number in the Mississippi Delta and more Chinese women became eligible for immigration, the Chinese began to discourage interracial relationships, leading some Chinese men to abandon the children they had with Black women. For interracial families that remained intact, their children were raised as Black. More Chinese also sought to join white Baptist churches. With Chinese men and Chinese women now having children on American soil, education became a controversy. The Chinese were allowed to open their own school where their children were taught in the Chinese academic tradition. Still, some Chinese parents wanted to send their children to public school, which led to one of the most hostile episodes in Black and Chinese relations. Gong and Catherine Lum were Chinese immigrants in the Mississippi Delta who had American-born children. When their children reached school age, they were permitted to attend the white school until the passage of what is known as the Asian Exclusion Act in 1924. And as the name indicates, it was designed to restrict immigration from Asia. Upon this federal law being passed, the white school expelled the Lum children. Gong and Catherine filed a lawsuit that reached the Supreme Court, arguing their children had a right to attend the white school. Some might ask, why was this controversial? Didn't Black Americans fight for the same thing? The answer is no. As we move further away from the civil rights movement, the Black American fight for desegregation has been repackaged as Black parents wanted their Black children to become friends with white children. School desegregation was about resources, not friendship. Schools were segregated on the premise of separate but equal, meaning that the Black and white students attended separate schools, but they were supposed to be equally funded. As we know, that did not happen. So say a Black child wants to be a doctor, but the school said child attends has no science lab. The child's parents find out the white school in their town has a state-of-the-art science lab. The only way the Black child could obtain access to that lab was to attend the white school. Remember, these segregated schools were still controlled by white school boards. The Black schools were often given old textbooks from the white schools, provided limited elective classes, and had neglected infrastructure. Naturally, many Black parents wanted their children to access the well-funded public schools that their taxes went towards. Still, integration was a difficult decision for Black parents, and none of them in their right mind allowed their children to risk life and limb in the name of making diverse friends. Their mindset was to survive in this country and hope to one day thrive. Their children must access adequate education. That was not what the Lum family was arguing. Their case argued that their children being associated with Negroes, as Black Americans were known then, would hurt their social status. They feared being classified as a Negro family because Blackness was a contaminant. Listen to political scientist Claire Jean Kim explain the dynamic in this clip.
World War II, there was, in the early 1900s through the mid-century, increased mobility for Chinese Americans in the South because of living in a black-white order, right, a segregated order, living under Jim Crow. They were offered certain inducements to come closer to whiteness if they would repudiate black people, and they did that in very stark ways. For example, this is covered in the book and the film. The book Mississippi Chinese and the film was called Mississippi Triangle. And many of the Chinese grocers who lived in the Mississippi Delta, for example, in the 1920s, by the way, this is the community that gave rise to the Supreme Court case Gong Lam v. Rice, where Chinese Americans challenged the placement of their children in so-called colored schools, and because they wanted to be able to go to school with whites. And their argument, very dramatically, was we Chinese people, being pure Chinese, deserve protection from the contamination of blackness as much as you white students do. That's why we should be able to go to school with white students. So they failed, but they sort of subverted the decision in the Supreme Court by just saying we refuse to go to school with Black children, so we're going to form our own schools or go to religious schools, etc. Okay, so this was the community that gave rise to that case. And many of the grocers had married Black women and had children who were biracial. And the white school boards, the white leaders in the town were quite explicit in the Mississippi Delta. They said, if you repudiate your Black kin, we will allow you to come closer to whiteness. And that's what many of them did. Not all of them, but many of them did. And this was why they experienced, the Chinese American community in the Delta, significant social mobility, like up through World War II and just past.
The Lums were not fighting to obtain equality. They were fighting to obtain whiteness. This is the difference between their case, which they lost before the Supreme Court, and Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended the separate but equal doctrine. While I understand Ryan Coogler wanted the Chinese at the Juke Joint, I wish he had used a more historically accurate way to do it. Perhaps a Chinese couple did patronize a Juke Joint, but any such interaction would be an outlier because history supports that many Chinese believed social isolation from the Black community was key to improving their social standing. Granted, the Black and Chinese experience in the Mississippi Delta is not a monolith. It varied from town to town, store to store, and family to family. As the civil rights movement progressed, Black and Chinese relations further deteriorated. Desegregation also neutralized the Mississippi Delta Chinese as an economic force. Today, there is only about a fifth of the Chinese American population remaining in the Mississippi Delta compared to the 1960s. One ethnic group mentioned but not shown in the film is the Italians. Smoke and Stack worked for Al Capone in Chicago, but Italians also have a presence in the Mississippi Delta. Like the Chinese, they were encouraged to come to Mississippi by wealthy planters to supplement the loss of slavery. Also like the Chinese, they faced their share of prejudice. While we are on this topic, let's settle a dispute. There is a social media squabble about the pairing of fried catfish and spaghetti and whether it started in the South or Midwest. It is a uniquely Mississippi combination. As the legend goes, some black folks and Italians were at work in the late 1800s and trying to find ways to make lunch easier. The black Americans said they would bring fried catfish, while the Italians said they would prepare a dish from their homeland called spaghetti. As the Great Migration took off, you can look at Highway 61, Interstate 55, and the pathway of the Mississippi River to see how the dish became so popular in the Midwest. I have a theory on why Ryan Coogler might not have shown the Italians in Clarksdale. The United States forged after waging war against the British for mistreatment and underrepresentation. Likewise, Ireland and China dealt with decades of British rule. So much so, many Irish and Chinese immigrants fled to the United States to escape the British. The Italians don't share that connection. Isn't it ironic so many around the world left British tyranny to build a life in a country that showed it can be defeated, to only uphold a new tyranny in their new home? You would think those experiences would foster empathy, but the opposite is often true. The pursuit of the American dream has a way of lionizing subjugated people against another subjugated group to prove their worthiness. And more times than not, that group is Black Americans. I could be wrong, but again, this is just a theory. So let's talk about Clarksdale, where Sinners is set. Its official nickname is the Golden Buckle of the Cotton Belt, referencing the Mississippi Delta's fertile land and cotton industry. Another nickname the city has is the birthplace of the blues. Now there is some tussling in the Delta that Clarksdale is not the birthplace. I am not going to say who is right or wrong, but let's entertain the discussion. Sinners references the Crossroads. As the legend goes, blues musician Robert Johnson was a guitarist who suddenly went from a novice to a master of the guitar, with many observers describing his evolution as supernatural. He began to play the guitar facing the wall to conceal his technique. The handful of recordings he made are the foundational chords still used in the blues today. He passed away mysteriously at the age of 27, making him the inaugural member of the 27 Club. The 27 Club is the legend of prominent musicians tragically passing at 27 years old, and this group includes Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, and more. The Crossroads is a thing of global legend but remains a local controversy. Let's start with Robert Johnson's family, who is still present in Mississippi. Robert's family denies he sold his soul to the devil at the Crossroads and has asked the public to stop repeating this story because they believe its origins are rooted in racism. Robert practiced guitar in a cemetery under the guidance of Ike Zimmerman. When Robert improved so quickly, Ike joked, "You must have sold your soul to the devil." Mississippi Delta blues legend Son House was shocked by how quickly Robert improved on guitar, saying, "He must have sold his soul to the devil to be able to do that." Stephen Johnson, Robert's grandson, who he never met, says family and friends who knew Robert were adamant he remained connected to Christianity despite the hardships he faced in life. Stephen feels the legend spread due to poor journalism, stereotypes around the rural South, and an attempt to discredit Robert's work ethic and brilliance. Because of the Johnson family's frustrations, I empathize with them that this story has grown fresh legs with the success of Sinners. Still, I understand why Ryan Coogler included it in the movie. Celebrity is a complicated thing. Sometimes allegations become a part of someone's legacy, even when unfounded. There is no way to explore Mississippi Delta blues lore without referencing the Crossroads. Another debate is if the Crossroads even exists. Robert Johnson was not from the Mississippi Delta. He was actually from Hazelhurst, Mississippi, which is located in the central part of the state. After he was shunned by Mississippi Delta blues greats for being lackluster, he returned to the Hazelhurst area and began practicing in the cemetery with Ike Zimmerman. When he returned to the Mississippi Delta 2 years later, he had transformed, leading some to question if his alleged Crossroads encounter occurred in the Hazelhurst area. Another Mississippi Delta town, Rosedale, is speculated to be the location the deal might have occurred, and residents argue their town should be known as the birthplace of the blues. Most historians agree we will never know the exact location of the Crossroads, but it remains a passionate debate amongst blues enthusiasts. A lot of comparisons have been made between Sammy, aka Preacher Boy, and Robert Johnson, but I see more similarities to B.B. King. Let's go through some parallels. B.B. King was born in LeFlore County, a Mississippi Delta county named in honor of Greenwood, LeFlore. Family instability led to him being raised by various relatives throughout the Mississippi Delta. He began singing in the Baptist church, but he fell in love with the music of the Church of God in Christ and changed denominations. He served as a janitor and children's Sunday school teacher in the church. He was there so much, people began calling him Church Boy, like how Sammy was called Preacher Boy. B.B. used his roles at the church to hone his guitar skills while his relatives introduced him to the blues, similar to how Smoke and Stack introduced Sammy to the blues. He performed on the local gospel and blues circuit, which caused him shame that he was straddling the fence. Once he decided to perform the blues full-time, he played a gig in Twist, Arkansas. A fight broke out between two men and a barrel lit by kerosene was knocked over. A fire started in the Juke Joint, which I imagine might have been similar to the fire in Smoke and Stack's Juke Joint. B.B. ran out of the Juke Joint but realized he left his guitar. He ran into the blazing building and grabbed it. By a miracle, he and the guitar survived. After the chaos settled the next day, B.B. learned the men were fighting over a woman named Lucille. He would name all of his guitars Lucille afterwards, as a reminder to never fight over a woman or do something as irrational as running into a burning building again. Like Sammy, the blaze led to a personal epiphany. Ryan Coogler did a great job of using inspiration without falling into imitation. Since this video is a history retrospect, I don't want to do specific critiques of the actors. With that being said, accents are a part of the history, so let's touch on it. Everyone in the movie managed to have a southern accent. Still, something I wish Hollywood would realize is a dialect coach can focus on an actor's accent, but developing cadence is what perfects the craft. Cadence is the rhythm and flow of speech. Usually when people from the same culture engage in conversation, it sounds harmonious because those people share the same accent and cadence. Some of the conversations in this movie sounded choppy, and I think the cast could have benefited from developing their accents as a unit. Also, some actors had a laborious rather than fluid delivery of their lines. But to give a personal nod, the best dialect in the film was Omar Benson Miller as Cornbread. His accent, inflections, and timing were so authentic, and he brought that dark humor. Music is the nuts and bolts of the film, particularly the blues. This section of the video is going to be more opinion-based, and let me say up front, I have been a regular listener of the blues since childhood, so that will be factored into my assessment. I enjoyed Miles Caden and loved that a real-life church boy and unknown actor was used to portray Sammy, and his dedication to learn the guitar is impressive. In the film overall, I thought the music was good, but it didn't blow me away. If you are new to the blues, this movie is a nice introduction, but as an active blues listener, this music didn't move the needle for me. The film's composer Ludwig Göransson is someone whose work I have enjoyed in the past, and I understand he probably composed his music with the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in mind. One critique I have is there was too much banjo played and some of the music had too much twang. The banjo is rooted in black culture and was played when singing work songs, which the blues blossom out of, but the two main instruments in the blues are the guitar and harmonica. By 1932, the piano and brass and woodwind instruments had more relevance in the genre than the banjo. While Sinners is not a musical, I think the lyrics could have been stronger to aid in character building. The blues is also known for its clever lyricism that was largely missing from this film. So I am going to describe the kind of music I felt would have been better in certain scenes by naming existing songs. Let me emphasize, I am not saying the actual song to be mentioned should have been used, but something similar in sound and theme would have been nice. One thing I appreciated about the music is it genre hopped throughout the film, as to show blues is the basis of modern music. So in the scene where Smoke and Annie rekindled their relationship, I thought the background music didn't speak to the sensuality of the moment. This scene needed some funk, and I think a new composition that sounded like Ben E. King's Supernatural thing would have been a fit. Most people have heard King's song Stand By Me, which is one of the most popular songs ever, but he knew his way around funk too. Supernatural Thing has a strong blues element, and the lyrics explain a man who is enthralled by the mysterious spirituality of his woman. Annie had just finished doing some root work, and funk music has an earthiness to it. Smoke wills himself to her beliefs, even though he doesn't completely understand them, and a song that reflected that would have been a nice touch. When Stack and Mary reconnected at the train station, I wished a new song like Joe Hinton's Funny How Time Slips Away was playing. This song was originally done by Willie Nelson, but Joe Hinton's version strikes the prettiest chord between country and the blues. It is about a lover whose ex has pledged devotion to someone else, but the former flames have unresolved affections. Based on viewer response, Stack and Mary seem to have the most controversial relationship, and I think a tender song could have humanized them to audiences. Also at the station, Sammy encounters Pearline for the first time and invites her to the Juke Joint. Out of all the couples in Sinners, we know the least about them. What makes Pearline decide to put her marriage in jeopardy for a man she barely knows? We know Sammy is more uninhibited because he is starting to separate from the church. This is a couple where I wish one of those blues songs that could have easily been conflated with a gospel song had been used. Here's an example. Still Away to Jesus is an old Negro spiritual composed by the father-daughter duo Wallace Willis and Minerva Willis, who were once enslaved in Mississippi within the Choctaw Nation. Wallace and Minerva were forced to walk the Trail of Tears, and they sang music together to withstand. While they were enslaved, they composed Still Away to Jesus, which also contained a subliminal message to other slaves to run away from the plantation. Still away is also a Black American phrase meaning to find time you think you don't have to get closer to Jesus. About a century later, Jimmy Hughes had the idea to rework the song, but this time to Still Away to Have an Affair. Hughes initially felt shame about re-envisioning a gospel song that was spiritually and culturally sacred, but Still Away became his biggest hit in 1964. Sammy and Pearline are being spiritually flipped in a similar way, and neither feels time is on their side. Pearline is breaking a covenant with God, her marital vows, and Sammy decides to lose his religion and give in to lust. Now, another great secular version of Still Away is by Johnny Taylor. He slightly tweaked the lyrics, and you can feel JT walking the tightrope of temptation on this song. Either way, a song that speaks to Sammy and Pearline battling the faith and the flesh would have enhanced the moment at the Juke Joint. All right, now that we are done with the music recommendations, we are back to history. That scene where the different cultures revolved around Sammy. Yes, I have something to point out. I wish HBCU majorettes had been included. The first HBCU majorette line was founded in Mississippi, the Alcorn State University Golden Girls. Over the years, we have seen HBCU bands perform at Super Bowls, and the style of majorette dancing has gone mainstream. Also, it would have been a low-cost way for centers to incorporate Mississippi talent, whether it be the Golden Girls, Jackson State's Prancing J-Sets, or Mississippi Valley State's Satin Dolls. Now that we have the regional history established, let's address what might be the most controversial part of the film, an exchange between Sammy and local bluesman Delta Slim, where Delta Slim says, "The blues wasn't forced on us like that religion. We brought this with us from home." A lot of people love those lines, but if you really study what inspired the great Mississippi Delta bluesmen to sing the blues, their explanation is the opposite. Most bluesmen and other Black American artists express that blues is an experience directly born from American slavery. We will go over a handful of quotes. When a Swedish interviewer asked Muddy Waters to define the blues in 1979, Muddy said, "You're going way back down in slavery time. I really wasn't no slave, but I really wasn't free." Willie Dixon said, "The blues are the roots and the other musics are the fruits. It's better keeping the roots alive because it means better fruits from now on. The blues are the roots of all American music. As long as American music survives, so will the blues." From an interview with Ray Charles in an issue of Ebony in July 1979, it says, "Charles doesn't mean that other people don't have troubles or do not express their woes through music. His point is that the blues has come out of a special African American group experience, slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the common human feelings of sorrow, joy, despair, and euphoria shaped the blues." Gil Scott-Heron, the poet born to a Black American mother from Mississippi and a Jamaican father, wrote in his poem Bicentennial Blues, "But the blues has always been totally American as apple pie, as American as the blues, as American as apple pie. The question is why? Why should the blues be so at home here? Well, America provided the atmosphere." W.C. Handy drew from musical influences all over the world, but he noted the music from the Mississippi Delta transformed his artistry because the agricultural and social isolation of the Mississippi Delta created a musical incubator that he had not found anywhere else. I encourage you to do your own research about the pioneers who forged the blues, and overwhelmingly, they did not reference Africa. I respect this film as Ryan Coogler's vision, but I wish the blues could have been spoken of the way the greats did. And as the video goes on, we are going to address more of the roles slavery, sharecropping, and convict leasing played in shaping the blues. From the time the blues gained traction, detractors have called it the devil's music. Centers insinuates this label is due to a resistance to African religion, but history shows it was a different issue. In most real-life conversations, the devil was spoken of in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the sins as a result of not telling him no. One sin associated with the blues is self-gratification, which means satisfying the flesh. This covers a multitude of sins like lust, adultery, drunkenness, and so on. So in many ways, the devil's music was synonymous with lack of self-discipline. Now, on the other hand, many people love the blues because it forces you to be transparent. How can you be honest with God about who you are if you can't be honest with yourself? Sammy leaves the church, but every bluesman who left the church did not repudiate the church. They often criticize the hypocrisy and politics of the church, but they also long to maintain a connection. Son House was a Baptist minister who left his congregation to pursue the blues, but he remained deeply religious until he passed away. Muddy Waters also spoke of his faith, and one of his unfulfilled dreams was to play in the Holy Land. B.B. King left the church and expressed conflicting views, but he remained adamant the church could not be separated from who he was as a person and artist. He once said, "There's a blues for everything that bothers you." I listen to gospel music and, believe it or not, I hear the same thing. The only difference is these people are praying to God or Jesus. Another element in the blues world is hoodoo and rootwork. I personally don't practice either, but I don't judge. Since hoodoo and rootwork are closed practices, I won't labor long on this subject, but I do want to point something out. Quite a few men practice hoodoo and rootwork, but we don't see them portrayed much in media. Still, terminology such as mojo are a part of the blues lexicon and can be heard throughout blues songs. Right now, we are going to get into the Black American Church, and let me be clear, I do not hold myself out to be a theologian. Sinners takes the Black Church to account, and what I am about to say is not a critique but an observation. I feel like the emphasis on African polytheism makes it easier for the church to evade the conversation. While there has been some disagreement about it in the Black American Church, it is more of a niche issue, especially in the 1930s. The bigger problem in the Black American Church has been denominational fighting and biblical interpretation, and I think keying in on those issues will force more churches into conversation. Mississippi has been a breeding ground for these debates, and one in particular went on to change the course of music. Charles Harrison Mason was a Baptist minister who grew a following in Mississippi. Although he was from Tennessee, he, like so many others, was changed when he touched the soil of the Mississippi Delta. As he was in the midst of a theological evolution, he met Charles Price Jones Sr. in Mississippi. Both men realized they were taken with holiness and sanctification and became a preaching duo spreading these doctrines to Baptist churches. The men taught their newly forged doctrine at a Jackson, Mississippi revival in June 1896, prompting the Mississippi State Convention of the National Baptist Convention to expel them. Mason and Jones decided to take their ministry to the Mississippi Delta town of Lexington and establish the Church of God in Christ, also known as COGIC, the following year. By 1907, Mason and Jones fell out over whether speaking in tongues was evidence of baptism by the Holy Spirit. Jones separated from COGIC and established the Church of Christ Holiness USA, also founded in Mississippi. COGIC went on to play a key role in the Great Migration, establishing strongholds in the Midwest and West Coast. Their music department was key to the church's growth, developing some of the finest singers and musicians in modern music. Now, I am not trying to claim these people as Mississippians, but what I am saying is the vision sprang out of the Mississippi Delta's rich musical fabric. There were certain practices Annie performed in centers that some Christians deny are rootwork or hoodoo since they performed them in the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am not here to force beliefs on anyone. I am just here to relay information. Churches remain in dispute if using herbs and other elements of nature qualify as rootwork. Some might cite a scripture such as Genesis 1:28, which says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." There are those who feel God has given them authority to seek remedies through nature. On the other hand, some churches teach that the scripture has been misinterpreted and spiritual experimentation with nature is a manipulation tactic and a gateway to become more dependent on nature than God. Annie performs incantations in the movie, which is also debated. Some people might cite scriptures such as Romans 4:16 to call of those things which be not as though they were. 1 Thessalonians 5:17 to pray without ceasing, and the many scriptures where the Bible speaks of tarrying. Others argue that true communication with God is through prayer, and prayer is a form of dialogue. They question that if someone is continuously chanting, where does God have room to come in and speak? I could go on with the doctrinal debates, but I won't for the sake of time. Again, I respect Ryan Coogler's vision, but considering denomination infighting was a bigger issue in the Black American Protestant church, especially in Mississippi, I can't help but wonder what kind of reckoning the church might have had if a mirror had been held up to itself. Black Mississippians have a complicated history with Pan-Africanism, largely because it was introduced adjacent to white supremacy. That last line might have thrown some folks for a loop, so walk with me. While Mississippi was a territory, it implemented a character test for the slaves of new slaveholders who moved to the area. Remember, slaves were property assets, so these slaveholders were told to vouch that their slaves were Americanized and wouldn't cause disruption. Mississippi continued this policy once it reached statehood. Slavery was lucrative, but some white Mississippians began to fear slave revolts. The enslaved population outnumbered the white population 3-1. That figure did not include the state's growing free black population. To address these concerns, select wealthy white planters founded the Mississippi Colonization Society in the 1830s to encourage free black Americans to establish a colony in Africa. Despite the idea having financial backing, many prominent white Mississippians were opposed to the idea. Sergeant Smith Prentice, an attorney and politician, said, "To free the slaves and let them continue in the United States would not, in my opinion, be any advantage to them, though if they could be transported to Africa again, it would be better, but it is impossible on account of their number. And even if they were all offered the privilege of going to Africa, I do not believe half of them would accept it. The sin of the business lies at the door of those who first introduced slavery into this country. The evil is now too deep-rooted to be eradicated." Prentice's assessment was accurate, but the Mississippi Colonization Society moved forward and founded Mississippi and Africa. The results proved disastrous for several of its members. Isaac Ross, one of Mississippi's wealthiest planters, mandated in his will that his more than 150 slaves be freed and transported to Africa. He ordered that his 5,000-acre plantation be sold to cover the costs of their transportation and ordered supplies to build their new community. He instructed that any of his slaves who refused to go to Africa be sold to the highest bidder, and profits from that sale would go towards building a university to educate the freed slaves in the new colony, while stipulating that families could not be split in the sale. When Ross passed away in 1836, his will immediately sparked controversy. His grandson Isaac Ross Wade filed a legal challenge to negate the terms. Other slave-owning families became concerned others would replicate Ross's will and began to advocate to their politicians. In 1842, Mississippi implemented a law that manumission, which was the process of freeing slaves, could not be done via will. The state also passed a law prohibiting slaves being freed by being moved out of the state. Despite Ross's grandson appealing to the state's highest court, the Mississippi Supreme Court ruled the laws did not apply retroactively and upheld the will. Of the 160 registered slaves in the Ross estate, 123 of them opted to be emancipated and go to Africa. The slaves who opted to remain in the United States were sold to other plantations. Most of the newly freed slaves were literate as they worked in high-skilled positions on the Ross plantation. They wrote letters updating Ross's grandson Isaac Ross Wade on their condition, but Wade was bitter about the situation. The former slaves wrote letters asking the Wade family to send money as stipulated in Ross's will. Instead, the Wade family wrote a letter in response saying the former slaves owed them money due to the litigation incurred from challenging Ross's will. In the end, the Wade family never sent the funds for development or education as stipulated in Isaac Ross's will. Josiah Finley, a first-generation Scottish American, was the first governor of Mississippi in Africa, located in West Africa. During one of his visits to the colony in 1838, he sailed around the area and brought several native West Africans with him. While they were sailing to the beach, the natives unalived Finley and took the large sum of money in his possession. Jeremiah Chamberlain, another supporter of Mississippi in Africa, was a Presbyterian minister and educator who was anti-slavery despite being a slave owner. As he became more vocal about his views against slavery and the possible secession of southern states from the Union, one of his fiercest opponents attacked him one day with a whip in 1851. Said opponent then unalived Chamberlain. Mississippi in Africa had already collapsed in the 1840s because many of the former slaves succumbed to disease, clashed with natives, and had no interest in doing agricultural work. Mississippi's free black population largely resisted the proposition to move to Africa and viewed the idea as a way of undermining all they had vested on American soil. White Mississippi elites successfully ostracized peers who supported the idea, and it became a taboo subject. In the 1920s, the Universal Negro Improvement Association gained traction in Mississippi. Also known as UNIA, the organization founded by Jamaican immigrant Marcus Garvey drew followers in Mississippi by promoting self-determination, ending colonization in Africa, and establishing a new nation in Africa. Most UNIA divisions were in the Mississippi Delta, and sharecroppers made up most of their membership. While Garvey never visited Mississippi, the statewide UNIA division sent a delegate to the UNIA's annual convention in Harlem. Just as Garvey was seeking to expand UNIA's operation, he had a run-in with one of Mississippi's native daughters. Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in Mississippi in 1862. After being freed as a toddler, she spent her adulthood amplifying the Black American plight. In the 1880s, she became possibly the first Black Southerner to file a lawsuit regarding segregated public transportation, and in 1909, she was one of the 6 people who founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known as the NAACP. After adopting Chicago as her new home, she became one of the most prominent Black journalists of her generation. Some Black American leaders began to question the effectiveness of Marcus Garvey's ideology, launching a Garvey Must Go campaign in response. Despite the friction, Wells continued to support Garvey. He invited her to visit the UNIA headquarters in New York and explained his plan to launch the Black Star Line, an international shipping corporation. Wells told him his ambition was admirable but poorly planned, and that launching the Black Star Line too soon would give his detractors the leverage they needed to have him deported. Garvey took offense to her suggestion and had her escorted off the UNIA premises, losing a key ally. As it turns out, Wells was correct and Garvey was detained. Some Mississippi UNIA members remained ardent supporters of Garvey and raised funds for his legal defense. Despite the efforts, Garvey was deported in 1927 and the UNIA withered. Still, Garvey's wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, continued to push his movement in the United States, but she struggled to find Black Americans who were enthusiastic about the idea. She, along with Louisiana-born Minnie Maud Lena Gordon, reached out to Senator Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi in 1944. He was an unapologetic member of the Ku Klux Klan and was a proponent that any presence of the Negro race was degenerative to society. Despite the outcry over collaborating with a known white supremacist, Gordon and Mrs. Garvey continued to coordinate with Bilbo with plans to ship Black Americans to Africa. He defined Black Americans as mongrels, which are dogs who are crossbred, but in the South had come to reference the admixture often found in Black American ancestry. He wrote, "The great civilizations of the ages have been produced by the Caucasian race. The mongrel not only lacks the ability to create a civilization, but he cannot maintain a culture that he finds around him." Black Mississippians were outraged by the proposal. Naturally, they were offended that Black thought leaders would connect with someone like Bilbo, who had caused so much pain in their community, and that Mrs. Garvey, who was also Jamaican, did not have the cultural connection to grasp why most Black Americans didn't consider Africa home. As World War II brought in a new generation of Black veterans, many Black Americans were more determined than ever to fight for equal rights in the United States. A coalition of Black and white Mississippians lodged a complaint with the U.S. Senate Committee to investigate campaign expenditures in a push to remove Bilbo from office. As a fight over his seat ensued, Bilbo passed away before a decision could be made in 1947. With his passing, the idea of shipping Black Americans to Africa was silenced. Of course, Mississippi has had other isolated Pan-African movements over the years, but as you can imagine, the tenacity most Black Mississippians needed to survive didn't make Africa a priority. This does not insinuate shame or disdain for Africa, but simply a blunt fact. Conjoined with the fact a voyage to Africa was often used by racists whose lineage on U.S. soil often didn't run as deep as Black Americans, you can see why African affinities are rarely espoused in Jim Crow era Mississippi. So what does American patriotism look like for a Black Mississippian? The 4th of July is a huge holiday for Black Mississippians, but maybe not for the reason many would expect. One of the most important battles in the Civil War was the Siege of Vicksburg. Vicksburg is the southernmost town in the Mississippi Delta region and site of the port that controls supply for the Confederacy on the Mississippi River. After a 7-week campaign, Vicksburg fell on July 4, 1863, and effectively ended slavery in Mississippi. While all Mississippi slaves were not out of bondage that day, similar to how Juneteenth is the Emancipation Day for Black Texans, July 4th is the Emancipation holiday for most Black Mississippians. I know the South in modern years has been portrayed as hyper-patriotic, but for nearly 80 years, the 4th of July was a day of mourning for many white Mississippians, and they only began to celebrate the day again during World War II. Ironically, Black Mississippians saw celebrating the day as an act of resistance, knowing its significance. So if you are Black with deep Mississippi roots and wondered why your elders celebrate the 4th of July like they were on the front line with George Washington, they are likely celebrating July 4th, 1863. The bitterness of losing the Civil War caused many white Southerners to resent the American flag, as the South fought under the Confederate flag and the North fought under the American flag. Many white Southerners maintained loyalty to the Confederate flag and promoted slogans such as "The South will rise again." There also was a push to rename the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. The Confederate flag was displayed prominently at Southern events and venues, while the American flag was sometimes not seen at all. Once Jim Crow took hold in the South, many Black Southerners saw the American flag as a dazzling symbol to counter the structural racism. While the federal government could have done a far better job stopping these state-sanctioned evils, making gains in Supreme Court cases, federal regulations against segregation, and finding a better quality of life in northern cities allowed Black Americans to develop our own relationship with the American flag. Allegiance to the American flag was again resistance to the South's white supremacist regime. While many Black soldiers did not receive just compensation when they returned from war, their presence in the military was a source of pride for many Black Americans because it showed the Black citizenry could make brave and intelligent contributions to society. Specifically for Black men in combat, their military training provided them with rare skills. Plenty of Black men knew how to handle ammunition, but think about the way Smoke was able to chop down the KKK and sinners. He was likely able to act with such precision because he was a military veteran. For the sake of time, I will not get into the full history of how the South became synonymous with patriotism, but in Mississippi specifically, things started to shift when Ronald Reagan appeared at the Neshoba County Fair in 1980 in Mississippi to lure disgruntled white Democrats to the Republican Party. It kicked into overdrive when the September 11th attacks happened while pseudo-Southern President George W. Bush was in office. Returning to the blues, it should not just be viewed as a source of entertainment, but also as a melodic archive of the Black American experience. Convict leasing was key in shaping the blues. After the Civil War, many of the emancipated slaves were homeless. Mississippi passed strict laws against vagrancy and began jailing the Black homeless population, leading to overcrowded jails. Edmund Richardson, known as the Cotton King, was looking for ways to revive the cotton industry after the abolition of slavery. He garnered his nickname because he was said to have been the biggest independent cotton planter in the world and the richest man in the South. Seeing the overcrowded jails, he proposed a deal that would allow the inmates to work his plantations in the Mississippi Delta. Richardson would provide guards, food, and clothing, while the state of Mississippi would pay Richardson for maintenance and transportation of the inmates. Mississippi outlawed this form of convict leasing in 1890, but penal farms continued to exist, with one of the most famous being the Mississippi State Penitentiary, also known as Parchman. Just as their ancestors before them, the inmates created work songs as they toiled, and their music drew national attention. To partially quote Parchman's marker from the Mississippi Blues Trail, quote, "Folklorists from the Library of Congress and other institutions also came to Parchman beginning in the 1930s to document the pre-blues musical forms of field hollers and work songs, which survived here due to the prison's relative isolation from modern cultural influences." Clarksdale, Mississippi native Sam Cooke scored one of his biggest hits after he and his brother saw a chain gang on the side of the highway and wrote a song titled Chain Gang. This video has heavily focused on the contribution men made to the blues, but it should be noted that female inmates were once housed at Parchman too. The Library of Congress recorded some of their music in the 1930s as well, later releasing an album called Jailhouse Blues in conjunction with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Sharecropping also played a key role in shaping the blues. Many people view sharecropping as a system implemented after the Civil War, but Mississippi was unique in that it instituted sharecropping before the Civil War. Sharecropping is where tenant farmers live on the land owned by another person in exchange for a portion of the crops harvested by the tenants. While the trauma of family separations was not as prevalent in this institution, oppressive work conditions and exploitative economic terms created another vehicle for slavery. This idea of living in abject poverty but being adjacent to prosperity is one of the themes embedded in the blues. Now, this section is going to be geared more towards social media responses to sinners. So let's talk about passing. Keep in mind, this will be from an American and distinctly Black Mississippi perspective. Before we go any further, there are two things I want you to do. First, please do not reference Nella Larsen's book, Passing. No disrespect to the book, but let me explain why. Nella Larsen was born in 1891 in Chicago to a white immigrant mother and an Afro-Caribbean immigrant father. Please no one take offense, but traditionally, Black American children had admixture from a white forefather and a Negro mother, and legally those children assumed the race of the mother. These Black American children rarely had white mothers in these times, and when they did, these children were often raised by their Black families. Larsen was also culturally disconnected from Black Americans. Her childhood was split between the white immigrant community in Chicago and Denmark. When she decided to attend the historically Black Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, it was her first immersive experience in Black American culture, yet she continued to feel detached from Black Americans. She was a somewhat controversial figure during the Harlem Renaissance because she largely did not relate to the elite Black American set. Her book Passing is semi-autobiographical, and while I am not saying her work shouldn't be appreciated, I am saying she wrote from a perspective far different than the Black American experience. The second thing I want you to do is not apply Louisiana's views on race and ethnicity to Mississippi. Louisiana is a beautiful state with a beautiful amalgamation of cultures, and although it is just west of Mississippi, the states are two worlds apart on the matters of race and ethnicity. I understand Louisiana has its own lore and makes for great content, but I think as we move further away from the Jim Crow South, more people think the entire South operated as Louisiana did, when in reality, Louisiana is an outlier in the country. To illustrate the differences, let's get into some constitutional law. The 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which grants states' rights, is one of the most debated laws in the land. When Mississippi became a state in 1817, its framers were intentional in not wanting a Creole, quadroon, or octoroon class. From the beginning, it instituted the one-drop rule, which means one drop of Negro blood makes you Black. Mississippi maintained this stance after slavery, with its black codes in 1865 stipulating that mulattoes were to live amongst Black people and not white people. The black codes also placed restrictions on white citizens, saying in part, all white persons so assembling with freedmen, free Negroes, or mulattoes, or usually associating with freedmen, free Negroes, or mulattoes on terms of equality shall be deemed vagrants. Now let's make this information specific to Mary in 1932 Clarksdale, Mississippi. I feel Ryan Coogler wrote this character well, but she seems to be the most misinterpreted by audiences. My analysis is too many people are viewing her from a 21st century lens and assuming Louisiana custom also took place in Mississippi. I am not saying colorism hasn't been a problem in Mississippi. It was, and it is. But in comparison, Mary would not have the leverage in Mississippi many assume. In 1932 Mississippi, Mary is a Negro. She is not a quadroon or an octoroon in Mississippi, and she is legally expected to be on the Black side of town. Many people have speculated Black members of the Clarksdale community avoided her because she could pass for white, but it is far more complicated. Remember, Clarksdale has always been a small town, so Mary's background is not a mystery back home. If Sinners aligns with the Mississippi law of the time, the issue is Mary broke the law. It appears Stack coached her on how to seduce a white man while concealing the fact she is a Negro. In many states during this time, including Mississippi, this was illegal. In 1930, Mississippi declared interracial marriage a felony and that the state would nullify interracial marriage if parties went to another jurisdiction where interracial marriages were legal. My interpretation of the movie is Stack and others in the black community don't want to be responsible for aiding and abetting Mary in defrauding her white husband. Presumably, her husband does not know she is black because she was prepared to ride back to Arkansas by herself after her mother's funeral. It was rather common for those who passed to avoid introducing their family to their spouse. But in a place like Mississippi, let's have a difficult conversation about what someone like a Mary symbolizes. Sometimes the offspring of affluent white men had access to land, education, and other opportunities that black Americans with no or more distant European ancestors did not. Yet these privileges did not necessarily translate to the white community as a whole. Some white people in these times would have a particular resentment for Mary that they didn't have for, say, Pauline. Mary is the living and breathing proof of the betrayal of a white family's patriarch. Along with the social rejection, the divide between white children and Negro children often spilled into a nasty legal fight if the patriarch left property to his Negro heir. All in all, it has been interesting to see the discussion Sinners has sparked around Mississippi and broader Black American culture. We will have to see where this movie shifts creativity moving forward. Thank you for spending your time with us. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And also check out our Substack at blackamericana.substack.com and be sure to sign up for our newsletter. See you soon. Thank you.